I feel like that's easier to hold than just the phone.
Okay.
All right, you're live now, hopefully? Okay. Howdy. Can y'all hear me? Are you getting sound? Can you hear me? Feel free to give us a thumbs up or like or some kind of affirmation. Can you hear me? Just testing. Is anybody on yet?
They're giving you thumbs up. You're good.
Oh, good. Okay. All right. Okay, well, howdy. I'm Tim Hartmann, Extension Horticulture Specialist out here in the Leach Teaching Gardens at Texas A&M University. It is a beautiful late March day. We're really happy. We got a little rain early this morning, so that was nice. We're going to wait a few more minutes for people to get online. I'm sure we'll have a few stragglers. Again, thank you for being here today, taking this time out of your busy day. We realize there are many things you could be doing on a Wednesday afternoon, including gardening. So we're very honored, and we feel we're very thankful that you're here spending your time with us. So again, we'll wait just a few more minutes. By the way, if you have questions, since this is live, I would be happy to entertain those. I'll do my best to answer them as we see them. So we'll probably do that at the very end. But again, if you have questions, please leave those in the comments section and I will answer them toward the end. So just wait a few more minutes. What?
19 people.
Okay, yeah, we'll wait a few more minutes. By the way, this is a really pretty peach tree. This is not a commercial variety. This is a seedling from Cynthia Miller. She's a really good friend of mine. She's been with the horticulture department for a long time as a volunteer. Just really a wealth of knowledge in horticulture. And this is a peach seedling that she planted at her house. Turns out to be an absolutely stunning ornamental specimen. Also produces pretty decent white flesh, kind of tangy, mostly freestone peaches in July. So this is basically a tree that I grafted. I took some of the wood off of her tree and grafted it here, and it's kind of a nice little specimen. So anyway, if you're curious what this is, it's not red berry, it's not any other flowering peach. Okay, what time is it?
1:02.
Okay. All right, and we have Brooke Blackshear here today filming, so we want to make sure we give her credit for making this happen. So we'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, I'm Tim Hartmann with the Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service. It's a beautiful late March day. It's hard to believe that March is almost over with. Yesterday was an extremely windy day, and then it ended up bringing us a little rain this morning, so that was nice. Fortunately, no tornadoes, no severe weather. But I am out here in the Leach Teaching Gardens here at Texas A&M, and we're looking at a really young, precocious peach tree. So as I mentioned before, this is just a seedling peach from my friend Cynthia Miller of College Station. Really beautiful tree, beautiful flowers, and this tree obviously is pretty small. Okay, it's really only about the second leaf. It's not it's having a little bit of trouble, so it's not growing quite as well as we would like. But so the point is here, we wouldn't normally want to hang a lot of fruit on a tree this small. What I do want to show you is look at the flower density on this tree. We've got flowers, we've got nodes less than an inch apart. Every one of these flower buds, for the most part, has popped open a flower. So this is really nice to see, and realize that not all of these flowers, not every single one is gonna set a fruit, but it has the ability to. Just as a review, peaches are self-fruitful. They do not need cross-pollination. So in essence, you can have a single peach tree, a single variety, and it will set fruit. Other crops like most plums, for example, most pears and apples require cross-pollination. Blueberries would be the same way. Now, even for select varieties like Methley, Ozark Premier on plums, Anna for apple in that case, these reportedly self-fertile varieties are still going to benefit from cross-pollination. But peaches, a single tree, a single variety will set plenty fruit, okay? So what we're looking at is a huge potential to produce fruit. This thing potentially could be loaded with fruit. And while that may sound like a good thing initially, this is not going to be a good idea. Okay, we'll tell you why. We'll kind of take a short walk over here to an older tree. So by the way, I want to mention that we're anywhere from about 2 to 4 weeks behind with the development of most of our crops. Some of our wildflowers, we've got Texas mountain laurel over there just now in full bloom, so we're a bit late because February was so cold. So this is a tree that was pruned about a month ago, and you could see that we're having some fruit set on it, okay? You can get an idea of the fruit set here on this one piece of young fruiting wood, okay? All right, so we've got lots of fruit on here. As a review, peaches produce on 1-year-old wood. So the wood, the shoots that grew last year are now producing the wood, okay? Just as a review, okay? So even though it may sound great to have this tree loaded up with thousands of peaches, you gotta remember that the plant can only handle so much. It has a limited amount of energy, and the more fruit you have, the more it has to split up that energy to feed more mouths, basically, okay? So what's going to end up happening then is if we leave all the fruit on a tree, we can end up with tiny little fruit. The other thing that can happen is it can weaken the tree. Got a helicopter going over. It can weaken the tree. It can stress the tree out. I have literally seen trees of different species actually end up dying when they're stressed out already because they have too much fruit, okay? Another practical problem we can have is we can have limb breakage. I can show you pictures of peach trees that break limbs. We see this in pears and other crops because the trees simply cannot handle that much weight, okay? Fruit quality can also suffer a bit. We can see some reduction in sugar concentration in the fruit, which of course we're eating the fruit because we want it to be sweet. So these are all reasons, okay? Now in other fruit species, things like pears, for example, pears and especially pecans, we can have a problem called alternate bearing, okay? So what that means is we have 1 year with a very heavy crop, that tree is really bogged down, and so the following year, it's not gonna have the energy in the fruiting wood to produce a lot of fruit. So we get this really cyclical effect where we'll have a heavy year followed by almost no fruit or no nuts in some cases, okay? So remember I told you that peaches produce on 1-year-old wood. If this tree is so loaded down with fruit that all it can do is sustain those fruit, it's not going to have the energy to produce vegetative growth. If that tree isn't producing new growth, new wood, it will not have wood for next year's crop, okay? So that's something to remember, okay? Let's talk about fruit size, okay? So average peach tree, Texas, we're looking at anywhere from 450 and maybe 700 fruit per tree, okay? That's if they're properly thinned. That is going to give us the nice big peach that we're looking for, okay? So if you say instead you want to hang 2,000 fruit on this tree, you could do that, but you're going to end up with 2,000 little tiny fruit. Because again, there's only so much energy to go around. Keep in mind that, you know, if you may not think of small fruit as bad, most of that fruit is going to consist of pit. You're going to have a lot of pit and not much flesh on that, okay? So how do we remedy this? We do fruit thinning, okay? So I've told you before that we're going to remove 40 to 60% of the tree's wood every winter. Now I'm going to tell you that you may have to remove as much as 90% of the fruit, okay? This is really tough, but you just got to take a leap of faith and do it, okay? Better yet, if you don't believe us, leave a branch that is unthinned and come back and do the rest of the tree thin it properly, and come back and look at that branch that's unthinned, and you will see the difference, okay? So what we're going to do in any case is we're going to leave about 6 to 8 inches between each fruit, okay? Here's a fruit here. This side, just cut this out of an orchard. It looks like it's probably a pan-tau or donut-shaped peach, but we're going to go about 6 to 8 inches. 8 inches is best for early ripening varieties. They don't have as much time to produce energy. So we're going to be somewhere between here and here, okay? Now we don't do this time of year, okay? Or we don't want to do this when the fruit are this small, okay? Some people will really get eager and they'll come in and start thinning these off early on, but realize we could possibly still have a light frost, we could have a hailstorm, and nature can do lots of thinning for us, okay? So typically the best time is to do this about 4 or 5 weeks after full bloom. The fruit at that point should be somewhere between dime and quarter size, okay? So if you do it too early, you're running the risk of maybe losing some of that fruit, having more of the fruit thinned off than you would like. If you do too late, you're not going to get much effect, okay? Early on during the fruit's development, the cell number, the number of cells, which are going to be probably in the millions that make a fruit, that is being determined, okay? So you already have, once you get to about this size, you already have the number of cells in that fruit has been determined. It's already set, okay? So all those cells can do is get larger. If we thin when they're smaller, when the peaches are about dime to quarter size, what's going to happen is there's still time for more cells to divide, more cells to develop, so we have a greater fruit size potential. So we do this again 4 to 5 weeks after full bloom, and we want the fruit to be dime to quarter size in size, okay? So by the way, there are different ways to do this. If you're a homeowner, you have 1 or 2 trees, you can come in here and you can pick off every fruit that you don't want, and you can leave. You can even name each fruit that is on here, okay? You can do this very tediously. Most commercial growers, though, they don't have time for this. Time and labor is money. They're going to use some type of stick or something. Oftentimes we'll take PVC, we'll duct tape it with some insulation, foam insulation, to make a pad, and we will beat this tree and knock off some of that fruit, okay? Then we may come in and kind of clean up if there's a few fruit too close together. If you are a homeowner, you just have a few trees and you have time, what you can do is you can get rid of the fruit that you don't want. So if you look here, we have what is called a double, okay? So a single flower has ended up producing basically 2 carpels. Okay, so we have a double, twin. Sometimes we'll have 3 or 4. While this may look cool, here's another one. This is not going to be ideal, especially if you're growing these commercially. And so these are the first things that you would thin off, these doubles, okay? Or anything that's damaged. We see some injury from plum curculio or something else, okay? Again, we do this about 4 to 5 weeks after full bloom, and we're leaving about 6 to 8 inches between fruit. Another thing to point out is a larger piece of fruiting wood can handle more fruit, okay? If it's something thin like this, that fruit is really going to pull the branch down like this, okay? So these are all things to keep in mind, okay? So let's talk about some other types of fruit. We've got a nice peach tree blooming here. Here's a tree that did not get pruned yet, but you can see it's got lots of flowers on it. So again, in about maybe 3 weeks, it'll need a good thinning job, okay? And let's talk about pears a little bit. Pears and apples, okay? We have what I believe is an Orient pear here. This is a good pear for East Texas or anywhere where fire blight is a problem. We're going to thin pears too, okay? We're going to thin pears about the same time, pears and apples. And we generally want to leave about 6 inches between each fruit. And one thing I forgot to mention on the peaches is that 6 to 8 inches, we want it in every direction, okay? If you have 2 shoots that are really close together, you want to make sure that the fruit in 3-dimensional form are 6 to 8 inches apart, okay? So apples and pears primarily fruit on spurs. So spurs are basically short little fruiting shoots. And usually the flowers are gonna be born in these clusters, okay? So potentially if we have good pollen, every flower on here could set a fruit. But what we're gonna do is typically we only wanna leave one fruit per cluster, and generally we want these to be about 6 inches apart. Again, we wait till these are gonna be at least dime size about a month later, okay? But I just wanted to show you on pears, this is the case for pears and apples, okay? All right, so let's talk about a few other types of small fruit. Now, behind us, we're not going to show you because we're talking about fruit, not grapes today, but we have the vineyard here at Leach Teaching Gardens, and grapes and many other small fruit. We don't necessarily thin the individual fruit, we thin by pruning, okay? So by leaving only a certain amount of fruiting wood, we remove much of the fruiting wood, we remove the plant's potential to produce fruit. And that's how we actually do much of the thinning on small fruit. Things like grapes, for example, blackberries, blueberries are going to be done this way. And we'll talk about a few other types of fruit. All right, so I've got some goodies here. The wind blew over my cup. Okay, so we talked about pears. Again, here's a better example. So again, we've got these short little spurs and flowers on them. So again, once the fruit are large enough, after about a month, okay, we're only going to leave one fruit per cluster. And we may, we're going to go about 6 inches before we see we leave the next fruit, okay? So we may have some spurs where we don't have any fruit, okay? So you get the idea. We would have about every 6 inches apart, okay? All right, this is an apricot. So apricots typically do not produce very consistently in Texas. So many people don't grow them. This is a plum. I cut this from at home. This, I believe, was Morris plum. And plums and apricots also tend to produce a lot on these spurs as well, okay? So plums and apricots, especially like our methley plums, tend to be smaller. So we can leave a few more fruit on there. On plums, we're gonna go about 4 inches between fruit, okay? Again, we thin at about the same time. This is a nice, strong fruiting shoot on a blueberry, okay? And so people will thin the fruit on blueberries, but oftentimes, again, we're removing some of the fruiting wood, and that's going to limit the amount of fruit that we can get, okay? We've got apple. We already kind of talked about apples and pears. All right, blackberries, okay? So here is a 1-year-old, this is a Fluorocane fruiting blackberry, the 1-year-old Fluorocane that was vegetative last year. Now it's producing its flowers, okay? So this went through the winter as basically a stick, and after it's received its chilling and now some warmer weather, it's starting to sprout out again. And each lateral bud, like I talked about when I did the blackberry pruning, has produced a short little fruiting shoot, okay? So we can see the flowers on here. So theoretically, yeah, we could come in here and thin these, but we normally do not thin blackberries. Remember how I removed a lot of the fruiting wood on the blackberries? We thinned them down to about 3 to 5 Fluorocanes. I also headed back those laterals. That all limits the amount of fruit that plant can produce, okay? So these are just some of the types of fruit that were thinned. Again, on grapes, we primarily do that by pruning, okay? We prune back to usually 2 bud spurs on most of our wine grapes. We're gonna get 1 or 2 shoots from that, and then a couple clusters usually per shoot, okay? So let's review again. Why do we thin fruit? Too much of a good thing is a bad thing, okay? The plant can only handle so much. If we leave too much, we can stress out the plant, we can have limb breakage, our fruit are gonna be much smaller, okay? Our fruit quality can suffer as well, and then for some species, like for example pecans and pears, we can end up with alternate bearing, where we'll have a heavy crop followed by a really light crop, okay? Again, with peaches, 4 to 5 weeks after bloom is the best time when they're dime to quarter size. We leave 6 to 8 inches between every fruit in every direction, okay? And again, just take a leap of faith. This is going to be good for the tree, good for you. It's just something we have to learn to do, okay? And at this point, I'm happy to take any questions if we've got any.
We did have one. How much water does a newly planted fruit tree need per week in the Camp Wood area?
Camp Wood, can you, I'm not sure where that's at. Is that West Texas? Okay, well anyway, generally we're gonna try to provide about 1 inch of water per week during the active growing season, okay? And so, you could figure that out for that size area, okay? But when they're first planted, initially when they're bare root, we're not gonna water them very much. They don't need much water until they start leafing out and growing. We don't want to overwater and kill that tree. And then after that, depending on your soil type, it's going to be once to twice per week, okay? And typically, until it starts really growing, you're looking at just probably about 5 gallons or so.
Bayou Valley.
Bayou Valley, okay.
And then, what about citrus, and when do we prune lemon trees?
Okay, good question. So we generally don't prune citrus very much, okay? You can thin the fruit on citrus, and citrus is one of the things that comes to mind that can overproduce. I've seen a lot of Meyer lemon trees, for example, in pots. They were really loaded down, and too much fruit was left on them. They were stressed, they weren't growing well, especially they didn't have a lot of nitrogen, and I've seen them actually die because of that. Okay, so yes, we can thin the fruit on citrus. Oftentimes, things like satsumas will actually thin themselves. You'll have a drop right after flowering, and then you'll have a later drop as well. But we can thin them as well. As far as pruning citrus, we don't really do much pruning on them, okay? And when we do prune them, if we need to, that's primarily going to be just to remove dead, diseased wood, freeze-damaged wood, for example. We're going to do that well after the danger of frost, okay? So about now would be a good time if you are going to do that, but again, we don't do much pruning on citrus.
Do you need to prune back native plums?
Native plums, you really do not need to, no. So native plums, like Chickasaw plums, for example, Mexican plums, they're definitely going to fruit on the spurs. The harder you prune something like a plum tree, the more vegetative, the more strong vegetative shoots you're going to get, and you're going to have less spurs, okay? That plant is going to go from a nice kind of compact, calm fruiting state to a very vigorous growing state, okay? If you wanted to, you could prune it to open it up a little bit in the winter time, but generally these wild plums, if you're using them for jelly or whatever, we don't need to prune them very much.
I cut my thornless blackberries. They were leggy. They're showing new leaves. I thin when I see flowers.
No, you don't need to thin blackberries, no. So if you prune it correctly, you should not need to thin them.
And then when do we fertilize?
What tree?
And then another question while we wait for that is, can I plant berries or is it too late?
No, you can absolutely plant berries. Now strawberries we plant in the fall typically. Our day neutral, our June bearing strawberries, we plant them in fall using an annual, basically treating them as an annual. But blackberries, yes, you can absolutely still plant them, especially if they're container grown. Okay, so the other question about when do we fertilize? For peach trees, it's going to be usually late February. Okay, you want to make sure that fertilizer is there just before the plant starts growing. And I would encourage you to go back and watch. Dr. Stein did a great job talking about fertilizers, all different types of fertilizers, when to fertilize, how much. But typically, especially for young trees, we're going to start that kind of late February, March, just before the tree starts growing. And the best is to do that monthly. Okay, do that monthly up until June. We want to stop fertilizing after June, though.
And then when to fertilize lemons?
Lemon trees, usually we start fertilizing citrus trees pretty early, usually around Valentine's Day, at least for this part of the state. We don't want to fertilize citrus, especially late into the season, because that can actually encourage a lot of new growth, which can render them more susceptible to fall and winter freeze injury. Okay, all right, well, great questions. Again, you can always email us, contact us at Aggie Horticulture. We'll have more coming up later. I believe Dr. Stein is going to do the, on Friday, he's going to do the
checklist overview.
Checklist for April. So stay tuned for that on Friday, and get out there and garden, do some thinning. For Texas A&M AgriLife Extension, I'm Tim Hartmann.